everyone. Just wanted to talk about the three speakers here today. So, Catherine, really excited to have Catherine on board today. If you don't know who Catherine is, she's accrued many years' experience working in the Australian real estate market. She's president of Australia's oldest economic organisation, Prosper Australia, and she's lectured widely on the real estate cycle and economics of land. So, if people like hearing what you have to say today, Catherine, where can they find out more information about yourself?
Yeah, if you just Google me, you'll find out plenty. But you can go to my website, which is cashmoreco.com.au, and there's a contact us form there, actually. If you fill that out, then I'll have your details. I'll be able to stay in contact with you because I've got some new projects that are coming out in the future, which if people are interested in learning more about the cycle, they can, I will be able to inform them if they want to do that. But otherwise, just Google me. You'll find me on Twitter and, various other places.
Yeah, beautiful. And if you don't know me, I'm an experienced equity crypto trader, and I use that combination of top-down and bottom-up approach to find, that ultimate buy signal where I can get TA, macro, and fundamentals kind of aligned and say that same thing. And the reason why I share so much of my knowledge is I've got that Bachelor of Education, and I just love sharing my passion that I have in the markets with as many people as possible. And I know the next person I'm about to introduce, Tung, is that same thing. He's gained an abundance of knowledge throughout his life, and I know he loves to share his knowledge with everyone as well. And he has a Facebook group called Savvy Investor. And do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself as well, Tom?
Yeah, sure. So Savvy Investors is a community that promotes financial literacy and financial independence. We've got a goal to help 100 people get to their first million.
Beautiful. And you said you were pretty close to that goal already. Is that right?
I think we've got 80-something millionaires now in the group. There's 12,000 in total, but over 80 are millionaires.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what number we get up to towards the end. All right, let's dive in. So today what we're going to be looking at is the real estate cycle, the property cycle. And then from that, I want to unpack a couple of key charts and things that might help us indicate where we might be within this cycle as well. So I've asked Catherine to come on board today because she's an expert in the field of cycles. And did you want to just kind of explain exactly how the real estate cycle works, Catherine?
Yeah, the real estate, well, it's a cycle that real estate correlates with, really. And it's based on an 18-year cycle, 18.6 years to be precise. But the way that to understand this cycle, really, I mean, there's a lot of talk about economic cycles, and obviously there's a lot of people that write about economic cycles. The real estate cycle is perhaps the most important one that everybody should be aware of. And the reason for that is that our economy is choreographed around the real estate market. The majority of credit is lent against land as collateral. And in the boom phases of any real estate cycle, that can be up to 90% of bank lending going onto credit. Certainly it's been like that in the US, in the lead up to 2007 and the GFC, we saw that kind of dynamic happening. And of course, land is so important to the economy in general because we all need land. I mean, we live on it, we bury our dead in it, we work on it, all our sustenance comes from land. And if you look at anything around you, it's from land. And when I say land, I mean all natural elements of the earth. So in economics, when you ever hear somebody who's an economist talk about land, they're not just talking about earth and residential real estate. They're also talking about commodities, and they're talking about the electromagnetosphere, and the internet and everything, all these items that can be enclosed and therefore monopolized. And that's essentially why real estate exhibits a cycle. It's because it is now a kind of monopoly in the economy. We are able to own real estate. We're able to leverage against it. There's only so much real estate that is desirable to live on. So it's like there's only so many good seats in town that are surrounded by the best amenities. And so everybody fights for those seats and they bid up the price of land. And of course, eventually the debts become more than the productive sectors of the economy are able to fund. And that's why we have the sort of big crash at the end of it that nobody apparently sees coming. And I guess what I would say that I'm here to tell you today is that it actually is possible to forecast the crashes well in advance if you have an understanding of the real estate cycle. And the first knowledge of real estate cycles really was back in the 1930s. It took a while. An 18-year cycle can actually be traced in traders and in commodities, and people were aware of that there was an 18-year cycle in regard to the stock market, in regard to commodities, long before they became aware of any cycle's relation to real estate. And part of that is because real estate data is very difficult to collect. It's like if you look at what we've got now, if we want to find out what a house sold for, we just go onto the digital database and it will give us some data back to around 1970. But if you want to go back further than that, and before we had digital databases and central databases of land and what land sold for, the way that they would collect data would be to kind of scrape it from individual real estate agencies or looking to newspaper adverts and try and scrape all the data from that to work out what median prices were. So the first work in earnest was really done on that in the US in the 1930s. And there were two men that everybody should know about. One was called Homo Hoyt, who was a real estate economist, and he wrote a thesis called 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago. And what Hoyt was looking at was just the area of Chicago in the US. His book was published in 1933. And he was identifying in that book that there had been these kind of waves of boom and bust in Chicago. And Chicago at the time was like a rapidly growing city. So it had like a population growth. It had a lot of infrastructure investment. So it had everything that kind of feeds into a real estate cycle, speculation, not enough land for the population, everybody wanting to live close to the infrastructure. And so he identified these periods of boom and bust, which kind of averaged out to 18 years. And Homo Hoyt was, he's infamous. You can find so much information about him on the internet because he was actually responsible for redlining in the US, which was the separation of the colored neighborhoods from the white neighborhoods. And so it became actually pretty controversial. If you've ever followed the Black Lives Matter thing during COVID, you would have perhaps heard some of the history of that. So he was very kind of high up in government, but he never really did a lot more work on the cycle than just identifying that there was a cycle. I think the person that did the most work on it was a guy called Roy Wenslick. And Roy Wenslick was a really interesting character. And unfortunately, it's almost like he's been written out of history because you cannot find anything about him online. He doesn't have a Wikipedia page. His books and everything that he wrote really aren't openly available. You need to go to the Historical Society of Missouri in the US to get hold of his writing. But his writing is infinitely valuable, and he was extremely popular at his time. He wrote in 1936 in the middle of the Great Depression, where nobody could even envisage that there was ever going to be a boom again. And if you read any of that history, that was such a bad downturn. I mean, it was a downturn where people were homeless. They couldn't afford anything. They were the old songs. They couldn't give me a dime. I mean, it was a really very, very bad time. And he wrote a book in 1936 called The Coming Boom in Real Estate and What to Do. And it could have been the brilliant spruikers, like he was the spruiker of the time, except he was extremely well versed in what he was writing. I think it was Simon and Schuster who published his work. And it was very well researched. It actually wasn't a book, it was a pamphlet. And it shot to the New York bestsellers list. So it was a lot of people I shot out and bought it, got hold of this pamphlet. It was very well researched because Roy Wenslick was kind of brought up in a real estate family. He worked in his dad's real estate company. He was a valuer. He was an economist, and he was passionate about trading, like economic cycles. And so he had done this analysis on the whole of the US, and he identified that there was this kind of average 18-year pattern in real estate. I think he did it on real estate transfers. And he was the first person to produce what he called was like real estate magazines. It was like the Real Estate Analyst, and it was like an annual publication that he produced for investment banks and big corporations about where real estate was going to go for the year. So if you like, he was like the core logic of the day. And I've got some of the old editions. They're brilliant. These great big binders, like full of real estate information about what was going to happen. And he did it right up to, I think, 1974 when he retired. If I've got the date wrong and anyone's watching this, forgive me, but it was in the 1970s where he finally retired and that publication went out. But in what he identified also was this kind of average 18-year cycle. And both these men had kind of got data from real estate agencies and as I said, newspapers, and they put it together. And of course, they were looking at the number of transactions and the median price, and how you kind of had this pattern of boom and bust. So the pattern, it was something that wasn't, I mean, they were the first ones really that we can identify that really started to write about this, but there were numerous other writers in the US that also identified this pattern. A politician called Clarence Long who identified a 17-18 year cycle in building activity. And then there were economists that followed the writings of Henry George. Henry George was a very famous economist that at the end of the 1800s wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, where he said, why is it that we have all this progress, but we still have immense poverty? And of course, he related that to land. He said, it's because people speculate and they monopolize on land. And we all need land, you know, and because there's that speculative process, it means that all the progress and all the profits from progress go to the landowners, and that creates terrible poverty for those people that aren't landowners. So you have this split between renters and the people that own land. And of course, they're things that we can still relate to today. But, you know, a bunch of economists that followed his writings, Mason Gaffney, Fred Baldbury, these are all very famous names for anybody that studies the cycle, but because they all identified this pattern in the US. And the way that the pattern works is you've really got around, on average, 14 years of rising land values and then a downturn at the end of the cycle. And the way that I usually tell my clients when I'm dealing with, because obviously I'm a real estate agent. Sorry, everyone, I know you all hate real estate agents, but that is my business. And so what I normally tell my clients is, if you go back in recent history, you can identify this. So if you go back to the last land-based led recession, which was 2008, the global financial crisis, the subprime crisis, and you go back 18 years from there, you get back to the early 1990s, which was also a land-based led recession. In Australia, it was known as the recession that we had to have, named by Keating. And of course, it was a very bad real estate crash in Melbourne and Sydney. Actually, commercial real estate at that time went down in real terms by around 50-60% in median values. Residential real estate only dropped around 10%. But if you look at what happened to individual prices of real estate around that time, it was a really bad time. And anyone that remembers the early 1990s recession, which wasn't me, I wasn't living in Australia at the time, but will know that it was an extremely bad downturn. Well, you go back 18 years from there, you get back to what was termed the OPEC crisis, but it was also a very bad real estate crash in 1973-74, and again quite a bad commercial crash, and real estate went down, and there was a lot of speculation along the Gold Coast at the time. And you go back 18 years from there, you get back to 1955, not such a bad recession, but still it was another land-based led downturn. It wasn't so bad because it came after the Second World War, so there hadn't been as much speculation in the run-up. There'd been the creation of suburbia, so a lot more housing built, which meant that there was more dispersion of what we call the economic rent, which is the price, basically the price of land, in a very simplistic way of explaining it. So there wasn't as much speculation, so there wasn't such a big boom and there wasn't such a big bust. But you can trace this pattern back to the 1800s in the US, back to around where the US started to publicly sell off its land, subdivide and sell off the land. And in the UK, a very famous author who has perhaps done more work than anybody living is a chap called Fred Harrison. He's a UK economist, and he has researched the real estate and he's traced it back to the 1600s. And, you know, I mean, I've done various work on the cycles in Europe, in areas of Amsterdam, where you get these long-term housing indexes where you can look at what the value of land was, and you can trace that cycle. It's pretty consistent. And what it's enabled Fred Harrison to do, hang on a second, is he is perhaps, and it's a big call, but I would argue that it's absolutely true, it's made him the most successful economic forecaster, I think, that is living, because it has enabled Fred Harrison in, you know, sort of decades in advance to forecast where there's going to be a significant downturn in the economy. And when I'm talking about a significant downturn, I'm not just talking about what happens to to real estate prices, we need to remember, of course, that real estate makes up a large percentage of wealth on the stock market, not only in the form of REITs, but also building companies and building materials and the things, anything that goes into real estate. So, development companies, creating real estate, housing companies, the materials for building real estate and building the infrastructure that gives real estate its value. On a company stock sheet, each company will own some form of real estate. So all of that kind of goes onto the stock market. And so the stock market plays along with this cycle as well. So when we get to the end of that average of 14 years of rising land values, you get what is a significant stock market downturn and a significant real estate downturn, like I said, like in the trend of 2008. Now, the only thing that I would say in regard to this that you need to be aware of is somebody might say to me, well, what happened in 2020? What about other downturns that we've seen in the economy which just aren't related to real estate? And I think that's what makes this cycle pretty interesting, because those downturns that come mid-cycle, there's really one significant one that we see mid-cycle. So, for example, the cycle that we're in now is going from 2008 to around a peak in 2026 before we have a downturn into 2028. So that's the forecast that you would have if you understand how this cycle works and the importance of it. Around the middle of the real estate cycle, you have what Fred Harrison termed, which is a mid-cycle slowdown. It's a slowdown in real estate values. Typically, it can be a plateau in real estate values. It can be a slowdown in real estate values. It doesn't typically affect real estate, but what you have is a stock market panic, and you have the economy generally going into a recession. Now, it can be a very mild recession, or it can be a very significant recession. Like 2020 was a very significant recession. And then if you go back to the recession prior to that, that was mid-cycle, which was between 1991 and 2008, it was a dot-com bubble downturn, which hit the US pretty badly, but of course it didn't really hit us as badly over here as it did in the US. And then you go back to the cycle prior to that, which was between the 1970s and 1991. It was the early 1980s recession. That was a very severe recession in Australia. I think unemployment went to around 11%, but real estate values didn't have a significant downturn at the time. We had a bit of a pause in our real estate values, and then everything carried on going up till the early 1990s, and then of course we had a significant crash. Now, when I'm talking to people here, I'm talking about it in the Australian context. And the reason I'm doing that is because the cycle is very much US based. The US is obviously the largest economy, the wealthiest economy. It still is, even though we have other hegemonic powers that are rising up and giving threats of war. And, we've got currency battles and everything. The US still has that status. And that means that the US still does kind of lead this cycle. It's a huge, massive economy. It has a massive real estate market. And so all the leading indicators and the very regular pattern of boom and bust that you can trace, a very regular 18-year cycle in the US, just doesn't apply to Australia. It applies to the US and the UK, but Australia is very much more of a younger economy and a smaller economy. So we now correlate with those cycles because we have a real estate speculation. It's very much a capital city cycle. So it has all the things that are in the capital city. You have to have population growth going into areas that are limited in supply, where you have to subdivide the land in order to squeeze the people in, because nobody wants to live where there's no amenities. So you have to have all of that. And then the tax policies have to encourage people to speculate on that land and not to work. And of course, our tax policies do that, because we tax income and productivity very heavily, but we don't tax real estate as heavily as we do those items. So people are far more inclined, if they want to make become millionaires, they're not going to do it by saving their pennies in the bank account from their earnings. They're going to have to speculate. And of course, land or speculating in certain stocks that are related to this cycle is certainly one major way of doing that. So I mean, that the real estate cycle really does apply to Australia now. We've correlated with the last 3 cycles, and we're certainly correlating with this one. But if you try and trace that 18-year pattern back in Australia, you will see that there were long periods in Australia where our real estate values didn't boom, and therefore we didn't have a significant bust at the end of the cycle. You can identify it a little bit clearer on the ASX than you can anywhere else. But that's that's the general overview of this cycle. I don't know whether you have any questions, but that's gives you some kind of pattern. And so the chart that you're seeing on the screen there shows you that kind of mid-cycle slowdown, remembering it can be a significant recession or a mild recession, but that would perhaps show you what we would expect to happen in real estate, which is perhaps nothing at all, perhaps a little bit of a downturn, certainly not a crash. And that was what enabled me to say to my subscribers, as we were approaching, the publication I write for had forecast that downturn years in advance. I wasn't the first author of that publication. A chap called Phil Anderson was, and he...
Phil.
Yeah, so Phil used to work for us at Prosper Australia. That was certainly how he got his, knowledge of economics. I'm president of Prosper Australia, and so I took over writing that publication when Phil branched off and set up his own service, and he's certainly done some tremendous work on the real estate cycle. But it was in that publication that we initially made the forecast for a downturn in the end of 2019 going into 2020, and it was what enabled me to carry on that forecast when I took over writing Cycles, Trends and Forecasts. And it was what enabled me to tell people that real estate, despite what was happening with COVID, was not going to crash at the time. And in fact, everything that we saw in the economy was indicating that there was going to be a massive boom ahead, and that it was going to be really generally applied to regional areas. And the way that I was able to forecast that really was understanding how the cycle is applicable in Australia. So hopefully that gives people kind of like a beginning idea of what we're talking about. If you do not understand the real estate cycle, you shouldn't be out there. You're going to be in a very misty area where it comes to trading, because this cycle, even though it's not, promised to make you wealthy, it is giving you very much forewarning that real estate is a big part of our economy. We need to understand where real estate is going, and we need to understand when the downturn is happening. Because if you get caught up and you don't understand that, then that's where all your profits that you're making at the moment can be wiped out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
Thanks, Catherine.
you now believe we're in the mid-cycle dip right now, is that right?
No. So the mid-cycle dip, so kind of culminated in 2021. So the mid-cycle dip is around 1 to 1.5 years. It comes sort of between 6 to 9 years into the cycle. So end of 29. I mean, as many of your viewers might be aware, who look at cycles and look at trading, there's a big astro thing to the real estate cycle, which we can get into if you want to. But so it isn't impossible. It's quite easy to time it and to know when that recession is going to come. What is a little bit more misty is what's going to trigger the recession. How bad is the recession going to be? What are the stocks that are going to benefit coming in and out of that recession? What's going to happen to real estate? Are we going to see a significant boom following? And where, you can make a lot of mistakes investing in real estate. So it would be where you're going to invest. So I would say where we are right now is approaching the peak of the cycle. And the peak of the cycle in terms, there's 3 peaks to the real estate cycle. Right? There's a stock market peak, there's a real estate peak, and there's a commodity peak. You need to be a little bit aware of how those play out specifically in Australia, because it's slightly different to how they play out in the US. But I would be expecting the peak to come around mid-2026. It might push a little bit later, but certainly I wouldn't be saying that the downturn would be any later than going into 2028. So we would be looking at a stock market panic and real estate panic at that time. Now, the reason that you don't want to jump into the real estate market and say, okay, I'll wait for the crash and then I'll just straight away jump into the real estate market is because, unlike the stock market, the real estate market is sticky. It's individual vendors selling individual houses right now. Whether we'll ever get to a point where, real estate is just all jointly owned, because it's just that's the way that the economy has, finance has evolved. I don't know, but it takes people time to sell real estate. So it can be up to a 4-year downturn in certain places. In Australia, in the bigger cities, you never really see that. The bigger cities are perhaps your safest place to invest, because governments rush to save the real estate market because of the way the financial system is choreographed around it. So you always see the government, rush in with various stimulus packages, and then that inflates real estate. And the area that it inflates it most is where that speculation is being buoyed most, and that's mostly the capital cities. And in Australia, it's the 2 biggest capital cities, which is Melbourne and Sydney, which perform very strongly in the first half of the cycle. And then as the cycle progresses and we get into the second half of the cycle, that's where investors start to get priced out of those areas, and they go into regional locations. And of course, COVID kind of boosted that. So where we are right now is approaching what again, Fred Harrison, readers must look him up. That honestly, we all ride on his shoulders. Phil rides on his shoulders. I do. Akhil Patel, who's another leading writer on the cycle, who writes from the UK. It's really on his research that much of our knowledge is based, because he just did such tremendous research. He's written many books in the UK and that are about the cycle and about the drivers of the cycle. You need to understand that, the economics behind it. But he terms the last 2 years of the real estate cycle as the winner's curse, which is that we are the most bullish stages of the real estate cycle. It's that point where the economy is flying, nobody can really see a downturn. They might talk about it, but FOMO is really in the market and everybody wants to get into the market. And if we go back to the last cycle, that would have been for Australia, it was really coming into the end of 2026 into 2027. Sorry, 2006 into 2007. I was working in the real estate market at the time, so I remember it. But it's that time where there's just so much speculation going on, and real estate is going up and up and up. We saw hints of it through when the stimulus, in between 2020 and 2021. I mean, the thing is government tinkers a lot in the cycle now. So you get, stimulus goes in, you get a bit of a boom, and then you get a pullback after that boom. But the overall understanding that the down points of the cycle are significant recessions in the economy is the thing to bear in mind. So we can have a downturn through 2022, and it was a significant pullback in the real estate market, but unemployment was very low. We've got now, the borders have opened, a lot of immigration coming in. So despite the fact that we had inflation, the people that were forecasting at that time, people like Chris Joy, who's a very prominent and accomplished economist, and saying, well, real estate prices are going to crash by 20-30%, were just, for people that understand the cycle, understand the history of it, it was a laughable comment to make. It was somebody who was looking through the lens of interest rates, real estate prices, and not taking anything else into account when it comes to analyzing real estate values. And a lot more needs to be taken into account with that, a lot more understanding of how technology, the gains in technology, are collected in real estate prices. Being close to internet reception, and how land values are affected by that, being close to infrastructure of train lines and roads, and where investment is going and where the best jobs are, like Silicon Valley. And why is the real estate so expensive? The land values always collect the profits that are being made in the broader economy. So you have to understand how land, you have to be able to really understand how significant land is, the effect of land on the economy. I would go as far to say that all the problems that we have around us today, the root can be found in the monopolization of land. So it goes a lot further than I think people really understand. And that's where your mainstream economists kind of go wrong. And it's partly the way that economics is taught, because there was a period of time where there were three flat factors of production: land, labor, and capital, that was taught in economics, in classical economics. And when neoliberalism, sort of took force, and they changed the way economics was taught in the universities, they wiped out land, and the factors of production became two, labor and capital. And that's why now when we talk about land price inflation, we say, it's our capital gains. But capital in the true sense of the word is anything that is man-made. The building on top is capital, and it depreciates with wear and tear. So when we're talking about real estate and we're saying that real estate is going up in price, we're talking about land going up in price and the locational value of land going up in price. And there's a very different analysis that has to be applied to that. And that's really the core really to real estate investment, and winning in real estate investment is understanding that dynamic.